Since 2015, Dr. Paul Galvez has been based at the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History here at the University of Texas at Dallas. After receiving his PhD from Columbia University in 2008, he taught at The Ohio State University and Wellesley College before coming to Dallas to help run our new master's program at the time and to finish his book, Courbet's Landscapes and the Matter of Painting, which will be coming out in the spring of 22 from Yale University Press, London. This is the first monograph devoted to the subject, and the study connects Courbet's palette knife technique to contemporary natural science, art, and literature, with particular emphasis on the problem of materiality and origins in painting. Paul's articles have appeared in October, Cahiers d'Art Moderne, and Art Forum, and he has texts on L. Lisitsky and Bernard Piferetti, which will soon be translated into Spanish and Chinese, respectively. His curatorial work includes exhibitions on Jay DeFeo, Rebecca Quaitman, and Martin Barret. Continuing his long-standing interest in the materials of art, his current project on Paul Gauguin's sculptures situates this understudied and highly diverse body of work at the heart of 19th century controversies over race, religion, and colonialism. Today, he presents Forms of Hybridity in Gauguin's ceramics. Let me welcome Paul Galvez.
Thank you, Michael, for that generous introduction. It's good to see everyone one last time before the winds scatter us to our houses again, or hopefully our porches. And I'm very happy to be presenting a new project to you. I won't say it's in its infancy because it's more like it's in an embryonic state. So I will be very glad to hear your contributions and responses, because I would say at this point, everything is rather new to me, but hopefully I can make sense of it and show you why I'm interested in the topic. Now, Gauguin ceramics were made mostly between 1886 and 1889. And as most of you all probably know, he's most famous for his painting, but he did a significant number of works in various sculptural media, including wood and stone. Before talking about any one of them in particular, I just want to give you a rapid slideshow of the works and to show you how wild and crazy they can be. So this first one is a jardiniere or planting pot in which you can see what you might expect a painter to do in ceramic, which is to paint, quote unquote, or mold the flat surfaces of the two-dimensional sides into relief panels and putting into them motifs from his paintings. And that's certainly what he does here. The figures and the geese come from his Brittany paintings, which he had been doing the year before and certainly through the 1880s. The other thing you might expect is to take up forms like this vase that had been spun on a wheel and to paint the slit around it with also the same kind of motifs, Breton motifs. In this case, you can see the headdress and the traditional dress of the women on the bottom right of the right-hand slide. Now, when things become really interesting, at least for me, is when Gauguin starts to mold clay with his own hands off the wheel in a method called coiling, which I'll get into, and starts to really begin to deconstruct all the various aspects of these ceramic vessels. These last two, pardon me, are works where you can see the Brittany motifs, but now wedded to these very strange objects. And as I go through this slideshow, if anyone can identify the sculptural tradition or decorative arts tradition from which these came, I'd be very grateful. So this one is stuck here at the base, which is a detail of the whole work on the right. And notice also the glaze, which I'll also get into. Sometimes he would put figures from other people's paintings. So this nude comes from a Puvis de Chavannes work, but now inserted into this pot, if you could call it that, with 5 very orifice-like openings. And you see, as he begins to kind of develop his style, that these orifices become more and more oversized and bizarre. Here, I just want to point out that if he painted the slips, sometimes it was not the entire figure, but parts of it, as you can see on the left. Here's more figures inserted, this time in a piece with handles. And I don't know if I could call that a lid, but let's say it's where a lid would be. This is another pot. And in this case, the motif that is carved into its side, it comes from a Indonesian bas-relief that he had a photograph of. And so you can see that Gauguin is not just processing his own art, other people's works of art, but also reproductions of older works of art and works of art from other cultures. This one, I couldn't tell you what it is. I think it's a vase, but it's pushing the limits of what a vase can be. And you'll notice that the figure on the front is kind of becoming bigger and merging into the body of the vessel. And that is something that will pick up, especially towards the end of this period. Just another one of these pots with ear-like openings. This one is interesting because the decor or the decoration is not just sculpted at the top, not just painted, but also incised into the surface. Now, towards the middle of this period, he starts experimenting with glazes and firing them at different moments. So here you can see quite well, because this often doesn't reproduce very well, but the range of colors, both inside and outside the vessel. Another larger work, the figure on the handle comes from one of his paintings. And one of the reasons why these photographs can show you this is because these were all taken at a show in Chicago at the Art Institute, because normally not many of these works are shown together at one time. So it was really a moment to photograph them under similar lighting conditions so you can really get a sense of what they look like. Because if you take reproductions from multiple sources, they vary in quality and color and don't really give you a good sense. So that's why also I'm showing you so many images. Now here you really see the anthropomorphism begin to take over the form of the vessel. And at one point, he started calling these things ceramic sculpture. So not deck arts, not ceramic, plain and simple, but ceramic sculpture. And one of the reasons he did that is because he began to actually shape the clay as a sculpture and then hollow out the inside afterwards, instead of building the coils around the circumference. This one is actually in the DMA. So if you are interested in this work, you can go to the Reed's collection and check it out. This is notable because the headwear becomes a snake and at the back of it becomes a hand. And this is one of the most freakish ones. It's a double-headed handled cup or container, but the figures themselves, the faces are very hard to read. And here's one where the face is inserted in a different glazing, i.e. not with no glaze, into the surface here. Now, these last two weren't made in the 1880s, but when he came back to France from his first trip to Tahiti in 1893 to 1895. So these are the last two, which I may get to at the end of the talk, but I just want to show you. This is the one that he wanted to have on his grave when he died. And it's very large. Just different views with a print that he made after it. And then finally, almost a death mask, although it wasn't a death mask, but a mask with features very similar to his own, stone, but kind of with mottled glaze. And this is one of the last works he did in ceramic. So how to make sense of this incredibly diverse body of work about which there is not much written. The two monographs on the subject really date to the 60s and 70s. And it's only in recent years that exhibitions have begun to feature them more prominently. The Chicago exhibition for sure, but also an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art that traced his work as it moved through various media. Now, one of the obvious reasons why it hasn't been treated is because painting has taken the central place in the reception of his work. Usually in art historical surveys, a work like Vision of the Sermon is presented as an example of symbolist art. And I'm showing you here an image of Albert Oyer, who was the first to really define Gauguin as a symbolist painter in this journal called the Mercure de France, which was one of the leading avant-garde journals of the late 19th century. And what you were taught about Gauguin is that he was an innovator in roughly four ways. He brought myth back into contemporary art after it had been more or less banished from realist painting between 1850 and 1886. He kind of radically innovated with color, using hues and combinations that no one else did at the time. He was really one of the first mixed media or intermedia artists. And that is that the subject that he treated in works on paper, like this fan on the bottom left, migrated to his painting and also to his wood reliefs. And for him, it's not as if one was the preparation for the other. They kind of migrated, which was one of the, or metamorphose, which is one of the arguments of the Museum of Modern Art show, which is why it was called Metamorphosis. And finally, the real emphasis on sculpture, which is really unique to him amongst his cohort. And you can see very early on that it appears in his pre-symbolist paintings. This is a Danish tankard that is in a sleeping portrait of his daughter. And that strange object in the back right of the self-portrait as Yellow Christ is this work on the right. Just another view of it. So if Gauguin's sculpture has been more or less consigned to the back burner in Gauguin's studies until very recently, it is also not very present in the history of modern sculpture. And there are several reasons for that, which I just will go over very briefly. One is that in the 19th century, monumental, kind of official marble sculpture was considered the highest achievement in sculpture. So long after painting had moved on to Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, the major works at the time were things like this sculpture of La Marseillaise that's on the Arc de Triomphe. And you can see that it's still wedded to the idea in European sculpture of the relief as a kind of three-dimensional picture that has narrative and kind of figurative content on a pedestal or base. And one that's a little more modern in the sense that the figures are dancers from the opera. This is Carpeau's allegorical figure of the dance on the front of the Paris Opera. So because of the conservatism of sculpture in the late 19th century, modern sculpture tends to be something that is either highly private or highly technological. So Degas, who is the other artist along with Gauguin, who was interested in all the media and sharing motifs between them, his famous wax sculptures of horses and bathers and dancers were more or less things he kept in his studio and never exhibited. And he used them to figure out unusual poses, new poses for figures in his paintings. And here you can just see how they were used in other media. The one on the right squared for transfer. The other artist who figures prominently, of course, is Rodin. And he had, in fact, both sides of the coin. He did do monumental, relatively traditional sculpture like the Kiss, but he also did radical works like the Gates of Hell, which was meant to be a monument. It was never installed as such. But a lot of his most inventive work is really private work that he kept in his studio, which you can go see in Meudon in tons of glass cases. And here is really where he experimented with sculpture as a fragment or body part, sculpture that is not wedded to a base, but seems to float or have no support in the center of the sculpture. And also the idea that you can take one figure and add it almost like an assemblage to other works to create new positions. And this figure made it into the Gates of Hell many times over. At the other end of the spectrum were sculptures that incorporated the latest engineering feats. Bartholdi did the Statue of Liberty, which were copper plates hung on a metal armature. And to do this, he had this humongous studio, factory size, where he employed a whole slew of men to drape the parts over the skeleton, which was designed by, or the design was advised by Gustave Eiffel, which is the other work that pushes the idea of sculpture, because it's a monument, it's an engineering feat. It also has an artistic value, so it could be considered, at the opposite end of sculpture from the private study. So if the history of modern painting and the history of modern sculpture don't provide much in terms of points of entry into this work, I will stick for the moment with the Eiffel Tower as was shown in 1889 at the World's Fair, known as the Colonial Exhibition. Because one arena of 19th century culture that this work does seem to intersect with is the flood of industrially produced goods and commodities coming from all over the world that were flooding into Paris in the late 19th century. I'm showing you here, in addition to the Eiffel Tower, a plan of the global village, quote unquote, which is a type of proto-Epcot center where each pavilion was a different habitation from a different country. This was the Balinese pavilion. or other Javanese, sorry, which Gauguin was particularly attracted to. And this was something actually that he had already experienced through photography. This is a Borobudur relief, the type of thing he would have seen in the pavilion, but which he studied in photographic form and incorporated into his sculpture. So this interest in non-European artifacts and the kind of explosion of decorative arts as a field predated the World's Fair. Now, it is not as if Gauguin was the only artist interested in art from other parts of the world, but most of the people in the Impressionist and post-Impressionist circles tended to gravitate towards things like Japanese art, which was considered almost a kind of Asian version of Paris. You know, Edo and its geishas being the equivalent of Parisian courtesans. And the elegance in dress, the kind of flatness and unusual perspectives in that work was something that was easily translatable by these artists into their own work. Therefore, it is significant that Gauguin, by and large, did not gravitate to Japanese forms, although he was interested in the culture. But at the same time, he didn't go down the route of the luxury good. And these are two works, an sculpture bust of an African man by Cordier and a piece from Belgian Art Nouveau that incorporated an elephant tusk, clearly brought from the Belgian colony of Congo in the 1880s, 1890s. And here you can see, you know, fetishization of material taking very racial connotations, as well as, you know, ones of colonial power. Now, Gauguin wasn't immune to this type of work. Indeed, he did a bust/vase of a Martinique woman. Gauguin had gone to Martinique in 1886, 87, 1887, pardon me. And when he came back, he did do several works that one could say borrow from that tradition, but clearly doing it in materials and in a form that are very different from the very polished, sort of overwrought, kind of fancy sculpture of Cordier. So now I want to turn to how Gauguin got to this point in his career, because if we're not going to get to him through the history of the other media, we can perhaps begin to see his interest in the rapidly changing field of decorative arts if we look at how his sculpture evolved in the period just before. So as I said, Degas was the other artist who was interested in different media, and this was the one sculpture he did show in his lifetime, very famously, the 14-year-old dancer at the Impressionist exhibition of 1882, where Gauguin saw it. Gauguin himself was doing rather banal sculpture, portrait bust of his children, which is what one would expect someone learning their trade to do, just as people often do their first paintings as portraits of their family. And these are two portrait busts of his children, one in wood and the other in marble. He was so taken with Degas' work at this point that he even took figures from his drawings and carved them himself in wood. The work on the upper left is a drawing by Degas, and the figure on the right is a kind of wooden figurine of a Parisian stroller in fashionable dress and umbrella. And on the bottom left is a portrait of Gauguin carving a work by Camille Pissarro, his mentor when it came to painting. You get hints here and there of his rather esoteric interest in objects that do not come from the French tradition. This is a casket onto which ballet motifs have been carved in wood. And scholars tend to think that he was referring to Danish funerary caskets because the inside of it has leather, which is often what you would find inside these funerary objects. And that's just to show you that the painting, one of the paintings rather, that Gauguin, sorry, borrowed from for his object. All right, so now we come back to the ceramics. He was always interested in it, but he really didn't have the means to do it until the artist Félix Braquemont introduced him to the ceramicist Ernst Chaplet, who at that time, in the mid-1880s, was the specialist in stoneware, decorative arts, and ceramics. When Gauguin arrived in the studio, his first works, as I said before, were to take his own motifs and put them on the planar surfaces of objects that were already laying around, like a jardinière. Chaplet is the one who taught him how to spin clay on a wheel to produce these relatively standardized forms onto which he painted Breton women. And this is just to show you what Chaplet was doing, which that's his stoneware vase on the left and Gauguin on the right. And this is just one last pot that I didn't show before, which is a self-portrait. Many people consider it a self-portrait in a very wild, blood-like glaze, which Gauguin himself wrote about. Now, before getting into a rather specific case study, I just want to point out that there was a crisis at this moment in terms of what style was in the arts. You had this influx of goods, you had industrialization, so you had a whole range of styles and motifs that you could essentially rip off for your own work. And many people complained about this historical eclecticism of people just combining Etruscan motifs with German ones with no real motivation for it. So on the one hand, in symbolism and in painting, you have a great interest in the figure of the martyr, the mage, the genius, the magician as the figure of the artist, and therefore the most original person out there. Because at this time, industrialization was, of course, killing off craft production. But at the same time, you have all these new and interesting motifs that were not really original, but imported from somewhere else. And so the crisis was, how do you find one's originality in art given these two competing forces? Now I want to turn to a couple paths that I've been pursuing in the first stage of my study of these objects. And that is to try to ask the basic question, what did Gauguin see, and how were those objects and cultures understood at the time? Very basic question, but not addressed in the literature as much as one would like. Now we know that his foster father of sorts, a man named Gustave Arosa, was an art collector and an entrepreneur who introduced him to many of the photographs that Gauguin would go on to use in his art. After Gauguin's mother died, Arosa took Gauguin in almost as a family member, and he's the one who got Gauguin a job as a agent de change or banker. And his daughter and his daughter's best friend were also taking art lessons. So Gauguin probably got through osmosis some of the technique of art, because one thing I forgot to say is that Gauguin is more or less self-taught in all his artistic endeavors: painting, sculpture, printmaking, drawing. I mean, he was basically creating his own rules. And as we'll see, although Chaplet gave him the point of departure, he radically broke with what Chaplet was doing very soon. But to go back to Arosa, he was a ceramics collector himself. And in addition to collecting ceramics, he had a company in which invested in a new photographic technology that won a prize in 1867 for its ability to capture detail and light and shadow. So having those two interests, he worked with a historian of the decorative arts named Auguste Demain for a history of ceramics, Histoire de la céramique, in which not just their own collections, but collections from the Louvre, the Sèvres Manufactory, and other notable collectors, including the superintendent of the fine arts, were all included. So not only was this book going to be the first of its kind with these type of illustrations, it was choosing the best examples that were on offer. And I show you one plate here that I think clearly was on Gauguin's mind. If not this one in particular, then objects like it. Now, my first hunch or guess was that perhaps if I were to go through all these plates, I would find vases, plates, designs that really evoke Gauguin, and therefore there would be a logical possibility of him using that as a source. But I very quickly found out that not only were there not any smoking guns, so to speak, but Gauguin, as a very omnivorous artistic mind, could have seen things pretty much anywhere at these collections with his friends in photographs. So instead, I just wanted to see, well, if this was a history of ceramics, what kind of history was being told? And how did that shape Gauguin's understanding of the ceramic art? So the first thing to notice is that the works are divided into national schools. This is the French school from different centuries, early modern on the top left, 18th century on the bottom left in porcelain, and even contemporary ceramic. And here's an example of historical eclecticism, because if you were to try to date this, you would not think they were all 19th century, late 19th century, except maybe the dog in the bottom right. And that existed at the time. I mean, it looks like some mistake, but there it is. And in fact, it was done by a very famous ceramicist. The works I'm going to show you now were actually in Arosa's collection. So he owned these Rococo faience or soft porcelain, kind of early Renaissance figurines. The work on the left were all of those, all of you who are involved with La Capraia, actually was made in Capodimonte in the porcelain factory in the 18th century. And then there were less, but still there, objects from Asia and Spain and the Muslim world. So after my searching through, these were the two that were most evocative of Gauguin. The work on the right, I didn't show it, but there is a Gauguin ceramic that has those exact handles. So what I did notice going through all these photographs is that many of the works came from the Sèvres porcelain factory. And I had been at Sèvres to do research on a completely different topic before, and I knew that they had a collection. So if the Arosa and Demain book was telling one kind of story, and they were getting the works from the collection of Sèvres, perhaps if you look at how the Sèvres collection was organized, it might have had an impact on Demain and Arosa. So the Sèvres porcelain factory was established in the 18th century, mostly to make luxury goods as gifts for fellow monarchs under the Ancien Regime. And what was most desired were these porcelain services. This one was actually designed and produced for Catherine the Great. And this, of course, is one sort of ceramic that Gauguin never, ever did. So looking into the history of the collection, I noticed that it was largely organized and administered by a scientist named Alexander Brongniart, who I also, worked on in another context. And Brongniart was an incredible geologist, scientist, but also administrator. So he had the brilliant idea that he was going to inventory the entire collection and acquire new objects for it using a new kind of classification system based on mechanical or technical production. So instead of by national school, it would be by technique. And at the time, that was quite new. And certainly no one did it to the extent that he did. So the preface or the kind of frontispiece on the left is the catalog, the treatise on ceramic arts and of pottery. And in it, in every catalog number, he gave a very modern account of it in terms of its information. So there was the date of acquisition, the date of production, the person who acquired it, the technique, in addition to the artist, or if there wasn't an artist, the culture. So the kind of thing that would be on a wall text today, and in fact, his classification system is the one still in use for dividing ceramics into historical periods. So what Brongniart did that was less emphasized in the Arosa catalog, or the Demain Arosa catalog, was this very, very detailed attention given to materials and how the object was made, down to the recipes for the clay, the number of glazes, the specific forms that were used. So if the Arosa was a kind of history of ceramics by national style, the Brongniart was a history of ceramics by technique. So as I pursued this further, I realized that many of the arguments or details evoked a very well-known text by Gottfried Semper called Style, in which he essentially tried to trace the origins of architecture to basic forms and functions and materials of human society. And in that book, Brongniart is not only mentioned in the first sentence of the ceramic chapter, but Semper actually says in each of the divisions that this is Brongniart's name for this thing. So they were clearly in a correspondence. And therefore, by triangulation, perhaps one could use Gottfried Semper's history of ceramics in style as a reference point for Gauguin's own sculptural production. And just to summarize very briefly, I know we're getting close to time. Semper basically reduced not just architecture, but design in general to 4 basic elements: tectonics or kind of structure that goes against gravity, the hearth, and that's where ceramics come into play, cladding or dressing, which is essentially textiles that are used to surround something, and stone cutting, which is related to the mound in his breakdown of the origins of architecture. what's interesting about this is that instead of relying on the traditional notion that the column came from nature, he said that the origins of architecture actually come from basic human needs like cooking, shelter, and that there were actual objects related to each of those activities. Now, in the ceramics section, some of those activities included scooping, pouring, storing or containing, and drinking. And he not only showed which forms were suited to this function, but he also explained cultural differences between societies based on how they scooped water or how they contained food. So for instance, the situla on the left was from Egypt, and the reason it's shaped like a baseless kind of expanded tube with a handle is because Egyptians got water from the Nile River. Whereas the Roman EODIAH on the right is wide-lipped and has a center of gravity closer to the top, because in Roman culture, people got water from fountains. And so you needed something that you could lift right to the faucet, so to speak. So he constructed this entire almost ethnography and anthropology of a culture through their architecture and design based on these fundamental prototypes that over time got expanded and then incorporated into larger buildings. So one thing that's interesting about that whole ceramics chapter is at the very end, Zemper says that the vessel that best encapsulates the given culture is one that shows somehow the material transformation that happened to make that object, its function, and that all this was unified in a symmetric, pleasing, polished form. So when I read that, I said, well, those are exactly the things that Gauguin sculptures are not. They are not symmetrical, they are not finely finished, they're not colored in an elegant way, they have no function, and you don't know sometimes what you're even looking at. So to conclude, let me just show you this one. What I think Gauguin might be trying to do is to show that to be original, what you do is not create your own style out of nothing, but you take given styles and you disfigure them or make hybrids of them. So in fact, paradoxically, to be an original artist, you have to kind of work with stuff that's not original, and therefore craft your own new originality. And I have given talks elsewhere exploring this idea in some later context, but this is the avenue I'm pursuing at the moment, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. That's great stuff, and it's obvious. I mean, I haven't seen much of his ceramics, so it's a nice introduction as well. As you say, it's quite a variety. Let me invite everyone to turn on mics and turn on video and join the conversation. And please, we'd love to get questions or comments for Paul. I'll start out while everyone is sort of tuning in. Paul, is there any evidence of him actually portraying his own ceramics and painting, or did any of these works or anything that may have influenced these works show up in his paintings?
Yes, there's that one in the back of the Yellow Christ painting.
Yeah.
But there are also works that have not survived or are lost. There's a particularly unusual one that is like the two-headed one that I just showed you. And the reason we know about it is just because he painted it in a portrait of one of his friends, Charles Laval. And we actually also know of a drawing. And there's one sheet of drawings that has sketches of many of these sculptures. So you can see how he was thinking about it. And he was clearly actually thinking in 3 dimensions, because that last vessel that I showed, he actually drew it 3 times from 3 different points of view. So he really wanted you to kind of get around it, look at it from the top and the side. And yeah, I mean, it's in keeping with the migration of forms throughout his work in different media. So they're not just on the sculpture, but the sculpture then pops up in the paintings. And that's consistent throughout his career. So it's something that he always had, even towards the end of his life.
And do you think that, I mean, when the drawings that you see, for example, of those pieces, are those drawings after the fact, after it's made, or is he actually sort of thinking through, is this part of the process of making them?
The sheet I'm talking about in particular is done after the fact, because art historians think that it was a kind of visual inventory of the works that he was going to send with his wife to Denmark. And that's why the New Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen has so many of them, is because they got Mettegaard's collection. I do think that he also drew things before carving them. So you have both cases.
Great, that's interesting. It's wonderful. It's great that you do have that sort of visual evidence that he's, actually taking that, because those can't be easy to, I mean, some of those can't be easy to draw either. I mean, they're very complicated forms. And as you said, from multiple views, they look very, very, very different. Let me open the floor up. Does anyone have a comment or a question for Paul? Oh, James.
Hi, Paul. Great talk. I actually have a question, and if you want to talk about this at the end, that'd be fine, about your forthcoming book, which I'm so anxious. I'm actually anxious to hear how the title developed, because last we spoke, it was like the origins of painting or something. So it's expanded. And just a quick question to remind. So it comes out later this year or through Yale, or I don't remember.
Yale, for whatever reason, has a 1-year out production process. Don't ask me why. And because of the pandemic, it got pushed even more, which I'm not unhappy about, because I feel for anyone's books who have come out this year, because there's no book launches or in person. And yeah, it's a difficult moment to have one's work come out. So as for the title, as Michael said in the introduction, the topic is more or less about both origins and material origins in particular. I just went back and forth between matter and origins in dialogue with my editor. So that's all. It's not like the subject of the book changed radically. Right. In fact, it didn't change at all.
Right. But it comes out later this year or in 2022?
2022, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Looking forward to it. It's really exciting.
Anyone else? A question for Paul?
Hi, this is Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi,
we
okay.
Can see you, but we can hear you.
I know I'm on the go, and so I can't turn on I'm on the go. So Paul, this was a really great talk, and I'm wondering, he seems in so many cases, if he is in fact, in dialogue with Zemper, read him, is kind of responding. I wonder if he's not simply kind of negating the model that Zemper is laying out, and more kind of undoing it, or because so many of the objects seem to verge on functional objects, whether or not they were actually used, this idea of a kind of tomb chest, a vessel, something that represents a face. I mean, these are elemental functions of art, funerary art, art of the, of the domestic sphere, art that represents the self. And so, I mean, was he not just negating these functions, but kind of playing with them and trying to move them or investigate their origins in another way that Zemper does not?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me start off by saying that I don't actually think Gauguin read Zemper.
Yeah.
I just think they're dealing with the same subject, each in their own way, which is the material origins of ceramics. When I read Zemper, not too long ago, for I don't know, umpteenth time, I was thinking exactly about this question. Did Gauguin agree or not with what Zemper's classification system was, and method and goal was? And there would be passages where Zemper would say something like, the object, in its purest or most basic form, has traces of the process that made it somehow very legible in its form, its function, in its choice of material. And I thought, well, there's plenty of Gauguins that do that exactly. It's just that, as you say, it's in the opposite direction. It's in kind of undoing or destroying or breaking the rules, so to speak. So I think where I stand out now is that Brongniart, Zemper, and Gauguin all had this really fascination for the material production of the object. They just went different ways with it. And you're right to point out the funerary and the religious context, because Gauguin certainly thought these objects had some sort of mythical functions in their society and would often write about it. And in his own writing, he combined myths from different cultures. So what's going on in his sculpture, in his ceramic sculpture, is also going on in his intellectual world and in his writing. And that's another reason why I tend to focus on this notion of hybridity at the moment, because it resonates throughout his work.
Yeah, it's a really, really promising project. I'm really excited to see where it goes. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in.
Anyone else?
Thank you so much, Paul, for your talk. Haven't you come to find with this, working on the three-dimensional is always a little tougher because there's so much less written about it. So trying to place artists within that kind of timeline is difficult, and Gauguin definitely doesn't neatly fit into any box or category. But what I was curious about is, like, there's so much that you can say about different dichotomies or how he could fit or not, which is interesting, and that speaks to the greater whole of the history of sculpture, the history of ceramics. But my question is, you said that Degas' works were mostly for private purposes, not meant to be seen, like tabletop pieces for his studio and inspirational. So were Gauguin's meant to be seen, or just the tombstone?
Yeah, that is a fascinating question, because there's evidence both for and against him showing them publicly. In his letters, when he first starts working with Bracquemont and Chaplet, he tells Metagod, his partner, I'm really excited. I think I'll be able to make some money finally doing these crazy sculptures. And Gauguin was perennially broke. So he was really excited about that. But on the other hand, he's very clear that he knows these works are monstrous and that no one would buy them in their right mind. And in fact, eventually liked that, even though they weren't going to sell. So I think, there was initial hope that they might be shown. There were plenty of Dec Arts exhibitions going on at that time that Chaplet was involved in, that Chaplet actually helped Gauguin get involved in. And Gauguin himself reviewed exhibitions of Dec Arts for magazines. So I think, there was part of him that did want to show them, but he also had other things that probably had more likelihood of being shown, like his paintings.
Okay, interesting. And also, you talked about how it's this kind of weird gray space between ceramics and sculpture because they don't have a utilitarian purpose. But could you also think of them as painting works as well? Because he uses colors and glazes, and you mentioned some of them on some of the sides are partially painted. So it's just so interesting.
No, your intuition is very good, because Merida Bodelson, who was a curator at the New Carlsberg Glyptothek and really wrote the book on Gauguin ceramics, although it's quite old now, but it's still the first stop on your journey. The most controversial and kind of radical argument in that book is that Gauguin's symbolism and his painting, what makes his symbolism so special, started off when he decorated the ceramics. In other words, the lines that you see in some of those ceramics that he traced sometimes in gold and sometimes in other colors, and they're highly schematic. They define forms in a very vague way. She believes that is the first time he does it, and that once taken with that, he started doing it in his painting. I think people nowadays would say that, yes, they're in both, but they were probably more simultaneous, and there was more of a give and take or to and fro between the media, because it happens all the time with him. But yeah, I mean, it's actually one residue of the painting-centric bias of work on him, is that even the people who were the most erudite and most familiar with his sculpture had to see it, had to read it vis-a-vis his painting to justify it. And of course, nowadays, post Duchamp, we're okay with three-dimensional objects and commodities being works of art. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that he's playing always between the media.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because Jacqueline's question just made me think of that. So but now I'm wondering about kind of the different experiences between seeing Gauguin's paintings and seeing one of these objects, which, correct me if I'm wrong, they look more or less portable, that you could pick them up and they have heft. More than that, as three-dimensional objects, one experiences, unlike a painting three-dimensionally, you can turn them around. They have different invitation points. I'm thinking about this a lot. I finally got my copy of Eloquent Bodies by Jackie Young, which I'm reviewing. Stay tuned, it'll be in Speculum. And she argues in that book that so much of late devotional Gothic sculpture are interpretations of it. It's all dependent upon the angle at which you approach the sculpture. And those interpretations, again, change depending on from where you approach. So I'm wondering kind of how that might factor in the future, Paul, about how very different is the experience of holding, experiencing heft, weight, thrust in one's hands, turning it around, seeing the composition, it becomes something completely different when you turn around, as opposed to a painting which kind of presents itself to you in simplistic and kind of comparative terms, presents itself to you more immediately.
No, I think you're.
There's no question in there. I'm just thinking of.
No, first of all, I think you're totally right. It's clearly one of the things that makes those things very modern. I will share an anecdote having to do with portability. I was visiting a collector, kind of great Gauguin collector, whose collection has now been dispersed, but he did have one of the ceramics I showed, and he had a health condition, so he couldn't move around very well. So he actually asked me to go get it from the table and bring it over. And I was shivering and my hands were shaking. The idea that I would hold this thing in my hand and what if I slipped and dropped it? And so in a weird way, it shows you that my view of the object is highly aestheticized, because I think of it as an expensive work of art. Whereas Gauguin probably did want you to move those things around on the table and put them up on your shelf. In fact, if you look at photographs of the time of some of his other sculptures, they're on mantelpieces lined up in a row. And the great thing about the Art Institute of Chicago show is the first time you could really look down on the works, which coming out of that show, you realize those openings are a big part of his deformation of ceramic form. And you don't really see it unless you come from the top, which of course would be a way you would see it if you were carrying it around and putting it on the table. You know, you don't put things up here, you put it down on the table. And so of course you're going to look down on it.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say is that I had this crazy idea to maybe one day get the museum, hopefully the new Carlsberg Glyptothek, to do a 3D scan of these things. So you could actually fill them with water and see what happens when you pour it out and see what happens. It probably would shoot in multiple directions. You know, you could feel how heavy it was in your hand, and that would get you around the holding the work of art problem.
Right.
So,
Jeffrey Chip Smith at my final thought, Jeffrey Chip Smith at UT Austin, he recently edited a book, of course, on Northern Renaissance articles. And I know two of those articles, one by Ali Stielau, who's a former peer of mine. She wrote a lot about weight of Northern Renaissance silver. And I think it's something that art historians are thinking about more. And I think museums are actually a little slow to catch up. You rarely see museum labels with the weight of the object. And I do think increasingly that is so very important. It so factors into interpretation and kind of one's experience, especially if it's an object designed to be lifted, to be carried. But I digress. Thank you so much.
no, I'll add that to the list. Curators, come do this, please.
Well, I had a question, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the aesthetics and about the style, because and I'm trying not to compare between painting and sculpture too much, but when I think of him, I think of these bright, vibrant colors, and there's something sort of grotesque, if I can say that. It's the organic forms, but it's also, I'm not sure what color that clay or that material is, but there's something very dark, and the glazes are a bit bloody, or on some of them. They have a much different look and a different feeling than his paintings. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about those aesthetic choices that he's making with this medium.
Well, I think your feeling of disgust is exactly what he wanted people to feel when in front of those things. In terms of color, they're kind of like terracotta when they're not glazed. When they are glazed, sometimes it looks like fire, sometimes it looks like blood, sometimes it looks like chameleon skin, or kind of glazed over leopard skin. And those effects often were arrived at by chance during the firing. So he actually liked the idea that the material kind of made its own form in a way. I would say that, you know, having kind of read a little bit, or starting to read in the Deck Arts journals of France at the time, porcelain was at the top of the heap. And if porcelain is shiny white, trimmed with gold, decorated with flowers, he wanted to do what was anti-porcelain. And so even things like the shine is something he was interested in. I think he worked in stoneware originally because he liked the matteness of it. And we know that he actually wanted his paintings to be matte for the color effects to work better. He didn't want this kind of additional bling on it to distract you. The other thing I want to say about the painting, the Moma Exhibition was an interesting case study because it was a print show nominally, but it had a lot of sculpture and a lot of drawings, but very few paintings by design. And I think the reason why is that because if there was a bright red or yellow painting next to all these, you know, darker and more mute works on paper and brown sculpture and ceramics, no one's going to look at them. So I do think the paintings kind of have that register of color that he's not doing that in the ceramics. And it makes you wonder, you know, does that mean he valued them more? I think he wanted different effects from them. I think probably in the end, he would have said he's a painter first and foremost, but he's clearly one who had ideas about how art is not limited to high art, but it can be found in functional objects, design, and three-dimensional objects. And he is the only kind of member of the canon that made objects in any significant way. So it was a real big step for an artist in that milieu to start making stuff. Yeah, so that's my roundabout.
And I think your idea about filling them with water, or a prototype of them filling them with water, is a really, really good one. I'm thinking of, there's a tea set at the DMA by Zaha Hadid, and it's a coffee, a tea, and then a creamer and the sugar bowl, and they sort of fit together. But they were donated to the museum originally because the owner, I forget who donated them, they weren't functional. That when you poured the coffee, it would drip down the side, and it didn't work except for as an art object. So I think that's a really good idea to I don't know, to see if you could see how those function as objects in that utilitarian way.
Well, especially because function is such a prime category for Zemper and other architectural historians for the history of architecture. The form function debate is like one of the biggest debates of the 19th century, and it plays out in different ways. But Zemper was really one of the strongest voices for saying that function, in addition to aesthetics, is at the heart of what humans make and design. Which may sound obvious to us, but at the time, the idea that aesthetics didn't drive beauty was considered scandalous.
Thank you.
All right, anyone else? Any other questions, comments?
Bravo.
Yes, well done. Thank you, Paul. What exciting stuff, and thanks for taking the time to finalize our spring season of workshops. So I'll thank everyone here as well for your participation, a wonderful conversation. I have this up here, so I will just to plug our conservation series, which starts. It's 4 weeks each Thursday, starting May 20th, going through June 10th. We'll have Angela Cerasuola from the Capo di Monte, Fran Bas, Laura Hartman, and Elena Torek from the DMA, Fernanda Valverde and Ariadna Rodriguez Corte from the Amon Carter, and Hus Verhaar, who is our postdoctoral scholar that's working between UT Dallas, the Corning Glass Museum, and the Rijksmuseum. These will be on Thursday, each Thursday, all at 10 in the morning, or at least, I don't know, at least the first one is 10 in the morning, I think, because we have a lot of Europeans, so they will be in the morning. So do join us, do spread the word, and stay in tune for news about our fall workshop series. So thanks again to everyone, and thank you again, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.